I'm Ezrah. Raya reporting on this week's burning issues and the biggest stories. This is the Manila Times. China slams what it calls a gunboat diplomacy as the Philippines and the United States kicked off their annual Balikatan exercises, or joint military exercises, Monday. During the Western Pacific Naval Symposium in Qingdao, to which the Philippines was absent, Vice Chairman of the China Central Military Commission Zhang Yujia slammed the Philippines and the US for provocative military drills. Despite China's aggressive actions, Zhang said China remains committed to resolving maritime disputes through dialogue. Filipino and American troops kicked off their military exercises last April 22. The training focused on defending Philippine territory against external threats. Other countries from Asia and Europe also took part as observers. The joint drills is set to run until May 10th. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is maritime security expert and director of Sea Light, shedding light on maritime gray zones. Let us welcome former U.S. Air Force Colonel Raymond Powell. Welcome to the Manila Times, sir.
Good morning. How are you?
So for my first question, China criticizes the latest joint military exercises between the Philippines and the US and claims they remain committed to resolving maritime issues through dialogue. So this was a few days before their latest aggressive maneuvers in the West Philippine Sea. So my question is, why is there a disconnect between what China is saying versus what they're doing?
Well, the disconnect is really between China's stated aspirations and its actual aggressions. So China has, for a long time expressed an interest in having dialogue and resolving matters peacefully and those kinds of things. The problem is that its ambition is to dominate the West Philippine Sea, and that comes into direct conflict with the Philippine sovereign rights. So those two things can't be reconciled. And so China essentially tries to sort of wrap its ambitions in a covering of reasonableness and sort of a gentle approach. And yet, of course, the pictures that we see that come out of the West Philippine Sea released by the AFP or by the Philippine Coast Guard show that that's not actually their approach.
So it's quite confusing, right? Because a few months ago, there's their presence in the West Philippine Sea, or what they claim the South China Sea, is constant. And just a few months ago, hundreds of naval ships were there. So the Philippines has been in this long time, a long running maritime dispute with China, right? And then which they took to the International Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2013, and the Philippines won in 2016. But China, however, has consistently refused to recognize the ruling. So ignoring a series of protests that we make almost every month here in the Philippines. So why do you think is that?
Well, China knew going in that the ruling was going to go against them because their claims fall outside the structure of international law. It's easy to overlook what a remarkable achievement the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was when it was put together back in the 1980s. And China eventually signed the convention and therefore, agreed to its oversight. But its 9-line claim or a 10-line claim has always fallen outside of that. And so China has tried to do both at the same time, claim to be agreeing with international law and yet cutting out its South China Sea claim, something separate from international law, to say, well, this international law doesn't apply to this part because this is historically ours. And so those two things were not going to be reconciled in The Hague. It was always going to go the Philippines' way unless something, nefarious from outside intervened, but it did not. The judges decided fairly, which is why China decided not to participate at all. It had no chance there.
In your recent podcast entitled Why Should We Care If China is the World's Biggest Navy, you talked about China's growing naval power. So what do you think are its implications for peace?
Well, what it does is it makes China exceptionally confident that it can eventually prevail in the West Philippine Sea. And so that is a big problem because a highly confident PLA Navy, a highly confident China when it comes to this long-term endeavor means that you have a China that's going to be less likely to want to negotiate on even terms. It's going to push its claims to the very limit, and it believes that it can out-escalate the Philippines because it has more capacity, which is why the Philippines recently has recognized that its best option is to network itself in with strong allies and partners like the United States and Japan to try to dissuade China to interrupt or diminish China's confidence so that China has to recalculate and maybe not think that its ambitions are quite so close as perhaps they would otherwise.
So the G7, right, the group of countries expressed support on the Philippines' claims on the West Philippine Sea. So did all the other countries. However, China seems to dispute those claims. So how else can we achieve a common ground in this issue?
Well, I think common ground is going to be very hard to come by because China's ambitions are so expansionist and so large and so, frankly, unreasonable. So what the Philippines has been doing has been trying to increase its leverage so that, first of all, again, China does not feel like it has already won, but has to feel like it must continue to push. So, unfortunately, this does not lead to a resolution of the matter, but perhaps it can push out China's belief that it can quickly get this done into the future, perhaps to a time when the Philippines' leverage improves. So, so that's essentially what the Philippines has been doing, is been trying to, through international support and, additional expenditures on its maritime forces, just trying to improve its leverage so that when it goes into a room to negotiate with China, it doesn't feel like it's standing there alone and unequipped.
All right, thank you for that, sir. Maritime security expert and former U.S. Air Force Director of Sea Light, Raymond Powell. And if you want to know more about maritime gray zones, catch him in his podcast. All right, thank you so much, sir, for your time.